Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. What is a human being? It sounds like a simple question, but in modern medicine, we're not always sure how to answer it anymore. If we're just biology, just chemistry, just matter, then where does human dignity come from? And why should it apply equally to everyone? Because today, in everything from IVF and embryo selection to end-of-life care to emerging technologies that promise to redesign the human body, the answer to that question isn't theoretical. It's shaping real decisions about who counts and who doesn't. My guest today is Dr. Ashley Fernandes, a physician, bioethicist, clinical professor of pediatrics at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and the associate director of the Center for Bioethics at The Ohio State University College of Medicine, who works at the front lines of these questions. In this episode, we contrast two fundamentally different visions of the human person, one that sees us as more than matter, and one that risks reducing us to it. And we ask, if we're just matter, why do we matter? Dr. Fernandes, welcome to Bioethics, Babe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that great introduction and for having me on your amazing podcast. I'm very, very honored.
It's my pleasure. So when we ask the question, if we're just matter, why do we matter? Are we getting at the most fundamental crisis in modern bioethics right now?
I think we are. I think that's such an excellent question to begin with, because a lot of times when people talk about bioethics, people argue about bioethics, they're missing their fundamental point of disagreement. So I can just give you a quick example. Take something like assisted suicide. Some will argue persons should be allowed to kill them, to have a physician help them to kill themselves because they are suffering. The other side, my side, our side, might say something like persons have dignity even when they are suffering that can't be taken away from them. Now, unless you understand or unpack the word person in both of those sentences, these two sides are never or rarely going to come to an agreement, because they both have fundamentally different views of what constitutes a person, and they miss each other. And so by focusing on, hey, what's really at stake here? If we can agree or start to understand what the human person truly is, I think we would have a better chance of promoting truth in medicine.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, when did medicine stop asking what a human being is?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I don't know if we ever stopped asking it as much as started changing the answer. Obviously, what a human being is fundamental to all of medicine, to biology, to chemistry, to anyone that's interested in the life sciences or the health professions. But there is a distinct change that starts to happen, I think, really in the 1960s and beyond. And it's obviously accelerated now. I think that there's at least two fundamental causes of that, in my estimation. The first was the secularization of society and the erosion of our what we thought were common foundational beliefs in things as simple as God, more specifically beliefs in Christianity, where most people held that view, even if you were a different denomination. So people weren't educated in the same foundational beliefs, either in the family or in schools. And then the second thing, I think, is the emergence of technology. When someone had a terminal disease or a heart condition or what have you prior to the 1960s, people had to accept certain things about life. They had to accept that there was an end to it, that we have to make this person as comfortable as we can while they're with us, and that this was not the only journey that we are on. Once technology kind of usurped the role of the natural death, right? And we could keep people alive even longer. If they had a medical condition, we could treat it. I'm not saying any of that is bad, but what I am saying is it changes the way you start thinking about yourself as a doctor or a scientist. Like, oh, I can do this. I can do more. I can do more. I can do more. And the humanity of that person can sometimes be eclipsed by technology. And I know we're going to talk a lot more about that in this podcast. So,
right. And I mean, my experience with modern medicine is that, and this was actually in the first episode where we talked about how modern medicine feels like you're put on a conveyor belt and you have X, Y, and Z doctor come in and you're just passed off and people are just looking at their computer to look up your data instead of looking at you to see why you're there, what your experience has been so far. And even there, you feel the sense that you're losing a little bit of your personhood in that experience, where doctors used to just come to your house and see how you're doing and ask you what your symptoms are. And you still, you have the same doctor. In fact, it was like the family doctor, right? So I think that we've kind of stepped away from that way of doing medicine. And I think that has also played a role in judging what a human being is and how to treat a human, right?
yeah, agree. I mean, there's an experience of depersonalization now in modern medicine that all of us go through, both in the outpatient and the inpatient setting. We have experience with this. Like, how we arrive at what true things are is at least in part through our experience. And this experience of depersonalization that we're seeing, I think a lot of it has its roots in technology, right? So if now I have to get chart notes done and I have to see you, maybe I can do both at the same time. Now, suddenly, what should be the center of the encounter is put off to the side in favor of the periphery. And the same thing happens with, like, I'm a pediatrician by trade. Take something like a child, a 5-year-old or 6-year-old boy that's jumping around in a kindergarten class. The teacher's like, oh, your child needs to be on ADHD medicine, on stimulants to help with ADHD. And I think, I'm 54 and I can't sit still for 30 minutes, let alone a 6-year-old boy. Like, there's nothing wrong with this kid. And, but what doctors will do is they will say, here's a problem, right? The person becomes a problem. They have the ability, the technology, the pharmaceutical ability, the technical skill to fix this problem. Now I feel better about myself because I'm doing something, but you're missing this child in the center and their gifts and their talents and their personality and what they should be. So it's a temptation because technology does do a lot of good and it's made our lives easier, but it's also a temptation.
So you're both a physician and a bioethicist. What drew you into wrestling with questions of human dignity in the first place?
Yeah, so I grew up in a cradle Catholic, very Catholic household. And I think anybody who's really serious about their faith, particularly in the Catholic tradition, always confronts issues of both sort of the modern world and the intersection of the modern world with what you're taught in your faith. And that kind of came naturally to me. My father was a physician. He was actually, before he was a physician, he was in the Jesuit seminary in India. And he left the Jesuit seminary and ended up becoming a physician. But right there, that's an example of being deeply interested in these two profound spheres of belief. I really never grew up thinking there was a contradiction between faith and science. And so when I went to college, I took a philosophy class. This is so crazy. It was a introduction to philosophy and it was on the Greek philosophers. And I loved it. Something about my brain, I was like, this is amazing and I want to study this. So I ended up getting 2 degrees. One was in biology and one was in philosophy. And when I was interviewing for med school, told them bioethics is kind of emerging as a formal degree, but I told them I want to leave med school after 2 years, get my PhD in philosophy, and then I'll come back. And that's what I ended up doing. And I found that the more I studied philosophy, the more it comported with what I thought was authentically true medicine, with faith as this overarching integrated piece. And when I studied philosophy, I looked through that with the lens of my faith. I bounced ideas off what I knew to be true. And the same thing with medicine. And what's beautiful is, honestly, the more you study, the more you realize how everything fits together. If you just, again, a lot of this is the Holy Spirit, but if you're just guided by the right principles and look at it with kind of fresh eyes, it has been an amazing journey.
And was that the moment, or was it a different moment, whether clinical or intellectual, where you realized that medicine alone couldn't answer the deepest questions about the human person?
So they're actually sort of one non-clinical and a lot of clinical moments. Let me tell you about the non-clinical first. When I was in college, now I'm really dating myself here, okay? When I was in college, Jack Kevorkian, who many of your listeners are probably too young to remember, but he was the first one with a suicide machine. He was a pathologist in Michigan, and he offered assisted suicide. He ended up in jail. But that his boldness in doing that kind of spurred on the assisted suicide rights movement in the United States. And that was when I was in college. That was a challenge to me, actually, because the patients that were being highlighted were patients who were terminal, who were suffering in immense pain. And that was a non-clinical moment where it tested me. I had to say to myself, this is what I know it's wrong to kill these people that have dignity, and they're calling it death with dignity. I know suicide is not right. I know, but these people are suffering, and that's the experience of it. So that was one moment when I realized just medicine alone can't give you the answers that you need. If you say, can you kill a person safely with prescription medicines? The answer to that is yes, insofar as you can kill any person safely. The answer to that is yes. But there's a additional question, which is, yes, but is it right? And that's a question medicine can't answer. You can do that with all kinds of controversies, right? People are like, oh, well, we can do abortion safely. Okay, you can do abortion safely. First of all, you can't do abortion safely for the unborn child, ever. But let's say we can do abortions safely for the mother. In fact, Arena, this is going to blow your mind. In med schools today, this is a line that they teach all the med students. Abortion is safer than childbirth.
Yeah, I've heard that.
That's actually taught to the med students. Now, how are they getting that line? Where does that come from? They're getting that line because they're looking at maternal deaths from abortion versus maternal deaths from childbirth, and they're saying childbirth has a greater number of maternal deaths. That, first of all, that's completely ridiculous. That would mean doctors would have to recommend abortion to every pregnant woman because it's safer. But the other part of that is one is natural and one's profoundly unnatural. But the third thing is all that does is tell you what is. I could agree to that. I could say, yes, the maternal death rate is higher in natural childbirth than it is in abortion, but that still doesn't answer this open question of, is this right or not? And these clinical examples that I'm giving you, we see every day. Medicine can't solve these problems of the human person, what their value is, whether a decision that they make about their body or about someone else's body is right or wrong. Those are things that have to be worked through outside the province of empirical knowledge.
And so who most shaped your thinking here, especially in the personalist tradition?
So in the personalist tradition, definitely Pope St. John Paul II, without a doubt. So my PhD dissertation was actually on philosophical anthropology of Karol Wojtyła, which was his given name when he was a philosopher, in the context of assisted suicide and euthanasia. So what I did in my PhD dissertation is I looked at personalism and contrasted it with this philosophy, which, for shorthand we can call materialism. But I looked at that at the main arguments for assisted suicide and euthanasia. And man, oh man, was that enlightening. I mean, it's so hard to read Pope St. John Paul II, especially his philosophical works. I did the best I could. I ended up getting my PhD from Georgetown on that subject, but it was a real challenge to read, but it was so enlightening. And then now when you go back, and I would encourage your listeners to think about going back and reading some of JP2's encyclicals, even some of you who are not Catholic and are interested in bioethics subjects, like the Gospel of Life is a great one, but they're deeply philosophical. They're easy to read. You can read them, but each word, once you study JP2's philosophy, you realize each word that he uses has this deeper meaning. And it's very, very beautiful. He actually described philosophy in the East, meaning Eastern Europe, as sort of like in contrast to Western philosophy, where you have point A and then there's a line and you go to point B and then point B. Okay, I got it. And then you go to point C. That Eastern European philosophy is more like going down a spiral staircase where you're passing the same point, but each time you pass that point, you're at a deeper level. And that's what you get when you read JP2. And he was by far the most influential person. I grew up with him. He was Pope in 1978, which is when I was like, I think in second grade. And most of my adult life, he was the Pope. So it was a great honor to study him.
Yes, he's been very influential in my life as well. So I concur.
Thought you're so young. I assumed that you wouldn't even have been alive when JP2 was around.
No, actually, my family and I got to see JP2 when he was at Giant Stadium.
Oh my gosh, that is amazing.
We were new Catholics at that point.
Oh my gosh. Well, congrats. Yep, that's amazing. Yep. You saw Saint. That is incredible.
Yes. So let's talk about what is a human being and define the terms, especially for our listeners who may not understand what Christian personalism is. What does Christian personalism say a human being is, and what is Christian personalism to begin with?
Yeah, great. So all of this, well, we're going to contrast, I think, the difference between Christian personalism and materialism. All of this in philosophy, in the philosophical world, falls under this rubric, which we call philosophical anthropology. I know that's a mouthful, but if you really think that through, it's basically talking about the philosophy of person. What is this thing? There's a whole branch of philosophy that just deals with what is the nature of a human being. Christian personalism is a very specific branch on that philosophical tree, and it's incredibly true and incredibly powerful. And when we go through this contrast, I can tell you, but essentially what Christian personalism says is that, and here I'm borrowing from John Paul II, is that human beings have certain qualities that are unique to them, and that together these qualities define what a human person is. John Paul II talks about 4 of them. The first one, he says, is the human being is the kind of being that thinks, that is, can reason. This is something that medieval philosophers talked about all the time. Man is a rational animal. You may have heard of that. That's sort of the old Aristotelian and then medieval definition of what a human being is. So it is true, human beings are born to think. They have the capacity to reason, but that's not all we are. We are far more than just our ability to reason, but it's an important part. What that means is, if you can think, if you can reason, then your experience can lead you to things that are true. But so let's hold on to that. A human being is the kind of thing that thinks. The second thing is the human being is the kind of being that can love. And there are no other creatures in our universe that can love another person fully. And that matters. That is this gift of self to another person. I want you guys who are listening to think about what that means in the context of medicine. If you believe this about what a human person actually is, then in giving yourself to another in love, that's a very beautiful quality for any being to possess. God has it, and we have it because we are creatures of God. The third thing is a human being has the ability to act morally. And here's a sharp contrast to the secular world. John Paul II says, well, look, it's not just our ability to think and to love. It's also we act in a moral way. We can choose to accept true things, or we can choose the opposite. So it is not the ability, and here I'm paraphrasing JP2, but he says, freedom is not the ability to choose. It's the ability to choose the good. Okay. Now, as soon as you say that, you've elevated something outside your own choice, right? There is this criterion of correctness for our choices. This is not often talked about in our society where it seems like, oh, I'm free. The more choices I have, I'm free. John Paul II would say, or Christian personalism would say more broadly, choosing is sort of what JP2 calls actus hominis. Acts that human beings do, versus actus humanus, which are human acts. And only a moral act is a truly human act. So again, choosing the good is the choice that frees, not the choice that binds. And that's a very important part of being a human. The fourth thing, and this is something we often forget also in our society today, is human beings were made for one another. John Paul II calls this solidarity. And if your listeners know anything about JP2's thought, this word solidarity was very important in Poland in rising up against communism, but he has a philosophical meaning to it, which is human beings were created to take care of one another. We can't fulfill our own destiny as individual persons unless we work to lift others up and to allow them to reach their potential as human beings. This is not an extra nice thing to say. We have to do it because we are human persons. And I think this is a very beautiful thing. It's not something that's often talked about, but it is a very beautiful thing. And it completes this idea of what a person is. Here's another example. Martin Luther King Jr. is considered a Christian personalist. And actually, he wrote a whole book on Christian personalism as part of his PhD. And he has this great line where he says, and now think about the work of Martin Luther King Jr., who was not Catholic, he was Protestant. But he says, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of humanity. And I think when you think about that, it means that we have to take care of one another, and think about the work that he did in the civil rights movement. Now you can see how powerful this concept is, that you just can't sit on the sidelines when your brother or sister is vulnerable. In the context of medicine, this becomes all the more important. Why should we care about this vulnerable, suffering person, the person with mental illness, the person who thinks that they are transgender, whatever it is? Why should we care? We should care because they are part of us. Our duty to ourselves is as strong as our duty to them. I think all of that is really important. I know I've been talking for a little bit, but I want to give your listeners these sort of two examples that I read recently.
No, I think that's really beautifully said. As we know, Surveys Pinkers talks about freedom for excellence, right?
Yes.
Not freedom from. And as I've mentioned before, too, in a different episode, and for example, music has its laws, and so do sports and everything else. And so if you're banging on the keyboard without following the laws of music, that's not music.
Yes.
And you have full freedom and you can bang the keys. That doesn't make beautiful music. It's when you follow the laws of music that you make beautiful music.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, we're created for this. There are a couple of interesting examples from science, from the world of science or anthropology. So in the world of anthropology, they recently found a skeleton of a man in Vietnam that's between 5,000 and 7,000 years old. And this is an adult human being that had a hunchback. Okay, they could tell from the skeleton that he had a severe spinal deformity and that he was an adult. And what the writers of this article were trying to get across was this man had to have been taken care of by someone else. Conditions were so harsh 7,000 years ago that there's no way this person could have lived to adulthood unless other people cared for this person. And I found that to be really beautiful. This is 5,000 years or 7,000 years before, or 5,000 years before Christianity, that God created human beings to take care of each other. It's in our genes in some way. But here's this sort of startling example of evidence that human beings took care of the vulnerable even pre-Christianity. The other example, which I think is very interesting, was I was reading an article about, I know I'm supposed to be a philosopher and a pediatrician, but I happen to be reading this article about human evolution and biology, and they were talking about how among the primates, human beings are the only human babies that do not instinctively cling to their mother or father. So an orangutan, a chimpanzee, a gorilla, when their newborn baby is born, they cling on to their mother, and the mother would have to shake them off or pull them off to let go. But a human baby, if you hold them to yourself and let go, they're going to fall. And so what's so beautiful about human beings is we have to hold on to our children, and our children have to hold on to us. And the writers of this article, who were not Christian by any means, they were talking about how in in the evolutionary process, this was an advantage because mothers had to hold on to them longer and be intentional about holding on to them. And fathers, I presume, human beings learned more. They were able to bond more. They were able to learn more because they were always had to be held by someone else. I mean, again, this is biology, but it's in some sense, it's a beautiful affirmation that we are made for each other. And we're not these radical, independent people that can do what we want and choose what we want.
Absolutely. And I think that this drives home the point that no man is an island. We are obviously affected by each other, and our actions affect not just ourselves, but those around us. So let's contrast this Christian personalism with the dominant materialist view. And can you explain what this view is in modern medicine and bioethics today?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a very powerful, let me just preface this by saying, this is a very powerful and persuasive anthropology. And we have to take it seriously. A lot of your listeners might be Christian, Catholic. Some of you are neither. But you'll see there's a rational appeal to this. Okay. So the materialist philosophy would basically say there really isn't anything transcendent about human beings, that our reality, what is real, are only the things that are empirical. So the things we can touch, the things we can create experiments about, the things we can surmise from our biological or chemical realities. So in other words, you're taking anything that's transcendent or metaphysical and you're removing it from the picture of reality. They're not saying like, oh, you can't have religion. They would just say, well, that's a really nice thing to have, pat you on the head and say, I hope it helps you to achieve your biological or evolutionary goals. If this is what you believe, and in medicine and science, it's really easy to fall into this. What are you studying? You're studying the human body. And that's pretty much all you're studying, right? So you're starting to get in like, wow, this is fascinating. This is fascinating stuff. This is amazing. The human body's so intricate. Maybe this is all there is. And if you're not taught that there's anything else, it becomes laser focused on this idea. Now, what are the implications of this? If there's nothing transcendent, and if all we are a random collection of atoms that's here by accident, which is what evolutionary biology would teach you, when you die, you become worm food and nothing happens to you. So when I make a choice, and the materialist premise, if I make a choice, what a choice is not, in contrast to Christian personalism, a move towards some good outside myself. A choice is the last firings of my neurons that go to my brain and give me information, and I make a choice. Now, what's that choice about? It's about my preference. And if you tell me, well, that's not right, you can't do that choice, in some way you're violating the only thing I have left of value, which is the end result of my neurons. So if there's no reality, then almost any curtailing of choices is problematic. Now, some people will add on to that, well, you can make your choices as long as you're not hurting anybody. But that little phrase, as long as you're not hurting anybody, is a completely unjustified phrase. It's slipping in some universal value that's not justified on the materialist premise. But take that aside. If you believe this, then there are all kinds of implications in medicine and bioethics. If I'm suffering or I'm in a lot of pain, why should I suffer beyond what I believe I should suffer? Because nothing happens to us when we die. There's no transcendent purpose to my suffering. And so why not allow myself to kill myself with a doctor's help? Just to take that as an example. If I thought that'd be a very persuasive argument. Like, what am I suffering for? And of course, that would change the whole nature of medicine. When you contrast this with what we just talked about with Christian personalism, there are choices, and then there are choices we make toward the good. There's actus humanus and there's actus hominis. So this is a really, really important contrast. And unfortunately, because modern medicine and particularly medical education and clinical medicine has become so materialist focused in many ways. We're losing what's really at the core of medicine, or what ought to be, which is the value of the human person.
Yes, absolutely. And I think behind all of this too is this idea that autonomy is king, right? It
Yes.
doesn't, as you're saying, whatever that person wants, since there is nothing transcendent, whatever that person wants is what should happen. Whereas Christian personalism has a framework about human dignity, and it's not just about what you want, but what is right.
That's right. That's right. One of my scholarly interests is in looking at medical ethics after the Holocaust. So in these papers I've written and the book chapters I've written about this, I talk a lot about how Nazi physicians experimented on people. They did a lot of horrible things. They were actually the principal instrument which led to the Holocaust, was the participation of physicians in the killing of human beings they thought were lives unworthy of life. And one of the things, they had euthanasia of disabled adults, disabled children, of people that they felt weren't medically redeemable, and they would have euthanasia. And this was state-sponsored, top-down euthanasia. So I started thinking about that. Most secular people, secularists, I should say, would say, well, euthanasia now is totally different because now people are choosing it. And that's really different than what the Nazi physicians did. And so I started thinking about that. And in fact, I wrote a paper on this, but this all comes down to this idea of autonomy and how important it is to modern proponents of assisted suicide and euthanasia. They're saying, oh, it's autonomy that makes a difference. The state isn't telling you you're useless. You're telling yourself you're useless. And I thought to myself, is that good? Is that good that we're allowing people to devalue themselves? Or isn't the point no one should be devalued? And so I started thinking about the role of autonomy. And I think where we've gotten to a point, and I'm not saying I'm optimistic. So I'm hoping that people realize we can turn this back. But modern bioethics has in some way said that autonomy is one of two things. It's either infallible, which means a patient, you can never be wrong about what they choose for themselves, or it's what I call it's unassailable, which means a patient can be wrong. Okay, I'm a woman and I think I'm a man. And we can say, well, I don't think that's right, but it's unassailable. So we just shrug and we say, well, I think you're wrong, but you be you, and we shrug. And so in either case, whether it's infallible or whether it's unassailable, most people that practice medicine, whether you're a nurse, doctor, any other kind of health professional, most people would say, well, that's not really how we want medicine to go. We have to limit that role of autonomy by contrasting with what are you, the content of what you're choosing.
So who are the key thinkers behind materialism, and how did a philosophy that reduces the human person to matter become so dominant in modern medicine and bioethics?
Again, two great questions. There's no one or two thinkers, but I would encourage, so it's a long process, progression or regression in the history of philosophy. Again, some people would sort of pinpoint this as the rationalists of the 16th and 17th century, people like David Hume, people who basically thought we could explain everything about reality in terms of our reason alone. So going back to those four criteria that Christian personalists have, it would just be saying, oh, we are thinking animals, right? That's it. That's all human beings are. And we can explain everything away through reason alone. And this long progression until the point where slowly but surely there's a separation between faith or religion and philosophy, faith or religion and science. And then in modern times, like in the 20th century and 21st century, there are a lot of thinkers, Steven Pinker, Peter Singer, who I think you mentioned before. And there's another, I would recommend your listeners to read Ruth Macklin, has a very short paper, this philosopher Ruth Macklin. And what is the title? It's called, okay, give me a second. I'm blanking on the name, but if they Google Ruth Macklin Dignity, it's a very short paper, like 2 pages.
We'll link to it.
Yes, I think it's Steven Pinker wrote a paper called The Stupidity of Dignity. Okay, that one I remember. It's a little bit more of an abrasive article. But both of these articles, they're short. They're both short. But both of them talk about how all of our human dignity is essentially autonomy. That dignity is a religiously laden term. We shouldn't be using the word dignity anymore. And that dignity is autonomy and autonomy is dignity. And so in the reduction of our choices, you're actually reducing a person's dignity. I think that's kind of the end result of this long process of kicking out transcendence from medicine and bioethics are these sort of two twin papers that say, okay, well, in the end, all we have is autonomy. And they're very, very insightful.
I blame Descartes for starting all this.
Yes. And he was part of that rationalist movement. And even though, like, if you read some of Descartes, like, so he has this paper about proving the existence of God through reason and the whole idea of I think, therefore I am. I mean, think about that. This is his most famous line, right? I think, therefore I am. It's a very interesting line. Like, if you look at it on a deeper level, what he's basically saying is who I am is reason, is this rational being. And this proof that he goes through to try to show that God exists through using reason alone is also pretty interesting because it lacks the influence of the transcendent altogether, which, it's a clever argument. And if you read the paper, it's clever, but it doesn't tell the whole truth. And that's a critical mistake. And we're seeing that critical mistake play out in medicine, in bioethics, in the way Europe seems to be going, where our beautiful churches are empty and they are more like Roman ruins than they are active places of worship. Although we may be seeing a little bit of a comeback I've been reading recently, so that's good.
So at its core, what does materialism get wrong about the human person?
I think it misses, though it's persuasive. Again, it's persuasive to say everything I need to know about the world is in my own hands, is what I'm seeing, is what I'm smelling, is what I'm hearing, is what I'm looking at. It gives a person a feeling of like control that I can. So it's persuasive in that sense on the human mind, but it's missing a whole sphere of knowledge, of not just knowledge, but a whole sphere of experience, which is the transcendent. That's fundamentally what it gets wrong. And that's why it's so dangerous. It purports to say we can explain everything arrogantly, says we can explain everything with just our minds and just what we're looking around. But we just know, like, from our own human experience, that truth can be grasped also as well as reasoned from, and that there are some things that just can't be explained by the mind alone, by senses alone, some questions that can't be answered. I mean, you and I have already talked about briefly, like if implant, these examples, these clinical examples, if you implant a long-acting reversible contraceptive into a poor teenager, you have a 99+% chance of reducing teen pregnancy. I'm willing to concede that point, but that's an is statement, right? You can do that. That's what medicine can do. But there's this second question. Yes, but is it good? And then a deeper question is it the good, right? Is that really what we want to do, is to implant this in every single teenager to prevent teen pregnancies? Probably not, almost certainly not. But those are questions that can't be answered through the materialist philosophy. So they're missing out on this huge redeeming part of human experience.
And now let's talk about dignity, human dignity, and where it comes from. Are humans' rights real, or are they just useful, quote unquote, fiction we've inherited?
Love that question, because even if you're Catholic, Christian, Buddhist, secular, atheist, that's an important question to think about. You don't want it to be that they're arbitrary. You don't want to be able to say that some people's rights matter more than others. Now, let's start with that. Like, there's almost no one that doesn't want a universal. I mean, I can't think of anybody that wouldn't say every human person deserves dignity and that we are all the same at some fundamental level, sometimes what I'll do in the classes I teach is I'll have my students read the UN Declaration on Human Rights. By the way, one of the architects of that was Jacques Maritain, a French philosopher, heavily influential in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And it is essentially a statement of personalism, right? But it's in secular language. You read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, nobody disagrees with this. Nobody. Liberals, conservatives, atheists, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, everybody loves that document. And it's because it speaks to something that we know to be true. And if you work backwards from that, you have to say to yourself, okay, if I believe that dignity is something that all human beings should possess, how do I arrive at that conclusion? Is this just an arbitrary preference of mine? Or is there a basis for dignity that no one can take away? Sometimes when I teach this class on medicine and the Holocaust, I teach to a diverse group of medical students, some of whom don't believe in anything at all, some of whom are Jewish, some of whom are Christian, some of whom are Muslim. And one of the things that really strikes them is that physicians in Nazi Germany were supposed to be the smartest doctors on the planet. And they actively chose to believe that some lives were worth more than others. The disabled weren't worth as much. The Roma people weren't worth as much. Gay people weren't worth as much. Whatever, Jewish people, of course, weren't worth as much. Now, when you do that, they can instantly see the injustice of it. You're taking something like the disabled, some group of people like the disabled, and saying, because they can't function the way we can, they are somehow worth less. And this strikes them all as very unjust and very wrong. But it also props up another question into the front of their minds, which is, well, if I don't want this to happen again, what needs to change? And I think what needs to change is this broadening of what a human person is and why they have value.
So, in a personalist framework, where does human dignity come from and why is it considered inviolable?
That's a great question. So, Christian personalism would say that our human value comes from the fact that we were created by this invaluable being. And as creatures of this God, we are given a value which can never be taken away no matter what circumstances befall us. If you're Christian, then you add another sphere, which is God himself became a human being, and this sanctifies every human being with a certain type of value. Now, how does that translate? People might wonder, into a non-Christian world or into a secular world. Well, you can still think that, I think people that don't believe in Christianity or don't believe in any God at all, I think it's still possible to believe, well, I know that these people are valuable, even if I can't articulate. So acknowledging that there might be some mystery outside reason, some transcendence outside reason, even if they don't want to admit that, hey, this transcendence is God. But I also think there's a practical element here, which is if you were not a personalist, if you were a materialist, would you rather be treated as a patient as a materialist, or would you rather be treated by a personalist? And I think almost everyone would choose a personalist. In my practice, sometimes I'll be talking to a family who's suffering a lot, and I'll say something like, your child has value to me. This is a child of God. Okay, I'll say that out loud. And I really don't pay attention to whether or not they're Christian or not. But I will tell you, I've never had a single family or patient be like, no, don't call me a child of God. Don't do that. I'm so offended by that, right? Because they know, even if they thought I was a crazy nut job, I think they know that everybody wants to be treated like a child of God, even if you think God's a fiction. That's one of the powerful things about personalism is because the person becomes the central unit of value in the universe, the individual person, everything bends to uphold this one person. And because of the solidarity aspect, you can't turn your back on people you just don't like or you just don't agree with, or people that have done things wrong, or people that can't function at the end of their life because they have dementia, or because they have an amputated leg, or because you just can't do that. Trains your eye to always look at dignity as of this individual person as the central unit of value.
And we actually did an episode with Monica Snyder, and she is a pro-life atheist. So if you're interested in her perspective on why there should be human dignity at all for preborn, etc., tune into that episode as episode 2. So in a materialist or secular framework, what are the most common ways people try to ground dignity? We already talked about autonomy, but is it that? Is it consciousness? Is it social recognition?
I think it's all of those things. So I think it's, you bring up two really good consciousness, that the fact that people can think, and it's not just, and that's really like, can you be conscious of yourself? But then you can see immediately the flaw in that there are all kinds of human beings that either can't think as well as others, or that have lost the capacity to think, or some disabled infants and children that will never reach a full capacity of reason because of their condition. And I think that is something that needs to be reflected on both by secularists, materialists, but also by us. What happens if someone doesn't think you're a person in the fullest sense? You're extremely vulnerable. And this has been true throughout all of history. The Romans, they actually had a very robust, as pagan as they were, they had a very robust view of personhood. If you were a person, no one could touch you. You were a Roman. And if you did have to die, and this is the contrast between Peter and Paul, right? Paul was a Roman citizen. St. Paul was a Roman citizen. So because he was considered a person, he had the benefit of being beheaded. And since St. Peter was not a Roman citizen, he was crucified upside down like an animal. And this is the difference between person and not person. And so when we say things like, like it's the capacity for thought, your ability to think, who are we excluding, and how vulnerable does that make them from that definition? I think social recognition was the other point you made. And that's really important too, especially nowadays with social media and how many likes you get and how important that is to people, but also preferences, how you view yourself, I think becomes that unit of value. This is getting back to the core of that is autonomy. So if I think that I'm worth something, then I am. If I don't think I'm worth something, or I think I'm worth less now, then I'm that too. And we see this not just played out in assisted suicide, but we now see it in things like transgender, I'll put care in quotes, but transgender ideology, where people's preferences have become the dominant aspect of whether they're respected or not. And take something like transgenderism. These are human persons. They have the same value as anybody listening to this, as anybody in the world, and nothing can take it away from them. And what I don't want to happen, and this is why I don't like identity politics, is for the focus to switch from the human person and the human person having intrinsic value regardless of what's on the outside of the human person to, oh, I'm just going to focus on gender or sexuality or the color of your skin. That is a dangerous thing because it's arbitrary. And it just takes someone to say, you know what, I don't care about that. Bye-bye. And you become extremely vulnerable. What values should be based on is something intrinsic, something that is immutable, that doesn't change regardless of your condition. And if those things are true, then what are the implications for us and our behavior, both in medicine and then outside of it?
Beautifully said. So do the materialist foundations actually hold up, or do they collapse under pressure?
I think they collapse, and you can see why. I could give you a million different examples, both in preferences that people would actually have, like who would you rather be treated by? You can think about the danger of saying something like science tells us that transgender science is true, as if that's dogma, right? Only to find out 5 years later that all of that so-called science is in flux and that European countries are pulling back from it and that now people are winning lawsuits. This is a really strange but horribly true story. In Belgium, they have allowed at least 5 transgender people to kill themselves by euthanasia or assisted suicide because those people regretted their transitions. That is a really strange, horribly disturbing nexus between the assisted suicide movement, the transgender movement, that shows you the danger of unlimited autonomy. It collapses on itself because, like all lies, it's just not true. And what is true is that people have value regardless of their preferences about themselves or about others.
Right. And actually, that's one of the myths that's perpetuated, that if you don't participate or go along with someone's desire to quote unquote transition, that they have a higher rate of incidence of suicide. But it's actually the opposite. It's because since it is more of a distress that has to do with their mental health than anything else, it's the opposite. Just changing the outer body, whether with puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or a surgery, doesn't actually fix that internally. And there's a higher chance of suicide for those who have gone that route. And so it's something that we need to continue to bring to light for the sake of people's dignity and protecting these vulnerable people, right?
Yes, I think that's right. But it also is a great illustration, of what we talked about at the beginning, which was the temptation of medicine to think that by doing things to people that we're helping them, but with no foundational basis for dignity. So it's just to make them, or to you as a practitioner, to feel good. And that's not a good enough reason when you're experimenting with people's lives. I understand that compassion that doctors who participate in this have. And I have patients that are transgender. I have compassion for them. I think that they are worth as much as anybody else in society. But I also know that just because I can do something doesn't mean I ought to do something. I mean, I also have patients with eating disorders, but if they think to themselves, I'm too fat, and they're anorexic, I don't affirm that belief about themselves, even if they say, well, if you don't let me not eat, I'm going to kill myself. Yeah, I'm sure their suicidality is higher in anorexia, but we don't give in to that preference of the patient when we know that the patient might be harming themselves.
Yes. So one of the questions, especially as we talk about where does human dignity lie, in this idea, there are some who think that dignity depends on function. So if human dignity is based on function, according to some philosophies, what happens to preborn babies? What happens to disabled people? What happens to patients with dementia?
Correct. Right there, they're sort of defining these groups of people out of the full breadth of what personhood, the possibilities of personhood. And I don't think most people want that. I think that's a very dangerous idea. You may be able to say, okay, well, an unborn child has some moral value. Okay, this is what bioethicists often say, right? Who are pro-choice or whatever, support abortion. They might say, well, we acknowledge that it has some value. Now thank you for doing that, by the way. You kind of have to, because it's not like a toenail clipping, like an unborn baby, obviously to everyone has some moral value. The question is, does it share that full breadth of value? And if you start by defining dignity as related to function, you're already defining out almost everybody who doesn't have fully human functioning. And then you could take it even further and say, well, what if you're not cognitively as able as other people? So people with lower IQs that are still can function in society. You could make the argument, well, you don't have as much dignity as someone who thinks as clearly as me. Now, it's very interesting and not coincidental that the people that are writing these papers and pushing these ideas are academics, ivory towered people who themselves, intellectual abilities or other abilities, function as key markers. So they're inserting their own bias and upholding their own dignity while denigrating people that can't function as well. And it's purely arbitrary. It's purely arbitrary in a world where not so long ago in the history of humanity, where physical prowess was probably the most important quality for survival. They would have been on the other end of the pole. So it's a very...
the person who comes to mind is Peter Singer at Princeton. And you can talk a little bit about what his idea is, especially as it relates to preborn babies, but he doesn't believe that babies before 30 days should even be considered human beings because of their cognitive ability, right? Can you talk about Peter Singer's framework? Is it a utilitarian view of a person? Is it materialist? Is it both?
It's both. I mean, he's certainly clearly an atheist. He's also a preference utilitarian, I believe. And so on that view, he essentially says there's no intrinsically good or bad act. You have to look at who it benefits the most, which preference benefits the most number of people. And that's the rational way to conduct your moral self. So the killing of a disabled child or the killing of even an infant under 30 days, let's just take that. I haven't read that particular paper, but let's just take that as an example. To be able to do that if you don't want the child, in the long run, adding up all the positives and all the negatives would benefit the most number of people. Steven Pinker, by the way, holds this view as well. It actually openly supports infanticide. And there is another paper, which I wish I could remember the author, but your listeners can Google this. It's called Post-Birth Abortion. Why Should the Baby Live? And the authors of this published in a fairly respectable bioethics journal, but essentially these authors are arguing that because we allow abortion inside the womb, and there's no cognitive or major biological difference between that unborn child and the born child just born, instead of calling it infanticide, we should call it post-birth abortion, because it's essentially the same thing and you're dealing with the same human being. Now, what's crazy about that article is they're just actually admitting that there's no difference between being born and unborn, right? But they're saying since we allow it in these cases for the unborn, we should also allow it for a certain period of time after the baby's born to let the mother decide whether they want to keep it or not. But this has made its way into the mainstream bioethics literature, if you can believe that.
It's crazy, but it is the logical conclusion. If it's okay to kill a preborn baby 2 minutes before birth, why not 2 minutes after birth, right? And that's the logical conclusion. And we're saying killing a baby, whether in the womb or outside the womb, is wrong at all times.
That's right. And it goes both ways. If you reject that dignity is tied to functionality, then if you reject that, then you can easily see how the womb makes no difference in the value of a person. Or take after the womb, like because an athlete loses a leg in a car accident and the one thing they loved, they can't do anymore. Do they lose dignity? Do they lose value? If they think they do, is that something we're okay with? Is their autonomy infallible or unassailable? And we don't have any right to try to help them to see that they have value anyway. This is also true at the end of life. There's no reason why, if we believe someone doesn't respect their own dignity, why we should turn their back on that person and allow them to believe that. That is one of the biggest problems I have with assisted suicide, is it does just that. It affirms a false belief that yes, people have about themselves, that they're a burden and that they've lost control, but doesn't offer us any solutions on how we can correct that. I'm not denying that people that want to kill themselves at the end of their life, who are suffering immensely or in a lot of pain, I'm not denying that they feel a loss of control or that they might feel like a burden on their family. But what's the truly human solution to that? Is medicine supposed to say, yeah, you're right, here's some pills, take this many, and you can end your life? Or is medicine supposed to work on upholding dignity through other means, palliative care, hospice care, friends, family, counseling, spiritual direction. That's where we need to go.
Absolutely. And of course, from the materialist perspective or autonomy-based perspective, yes, if you feel like you don't have dignity, well, we can do away with you. If this is what you want, let us dispense this for you. And this is one of the reasons I don't like referring to doctors or healthcare professionals as providers. They're not dispensers of whatever your wish is, right? They're healthcare. This is a profession to uphold the dignity of human life. It's not just to dispense whatever the patient wants, which may be very bad for him.
100% agree. We have to get rid of using the word provider. It's it does sound like a vending machine, and practitioner, physician, nurse practitioner, whatever it is you are, call yourself by that name, because you're more than just a vending machine. And you have to be, because people who are vulnerable, sometimes decisions that they're making and the way that they're thinking in the context of illness needs someone to guide them toward the truth about their humanity.
Absolutely. And when you were talking about how everyone believes in human dignity, when you're talking about Steven Pinker or Peter Singer, I'm not sure that's the case, right? And those who write about post-birth abortion, there's something that's lost there in translation. Why is that kind of thinking so dangerous, and especially for people who are most vulnerable?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's very self-centered to say, I mean, in some ways, like, so Steven Pinker and Peter Singer, the authors of the post-birth abortion article, I think they actually probably do believe in dignity, but just for themselves and just for people like them. And it's a very selfish way of looking at it. There's an interesting story about Peter Singer, by the way. His mom was suffering from dementia, I believe, and was near death. And someone asked him, like, do you want to give her assisted suicide? Would you support this or whatever? And he actually wasn't sure. He demurred at that question, and it was everybody in the bioethics world was like, whoa, wait a minute. I thought you had said all along that this was the most dignified thing you could do for a person. But then he backs off at the end. So I think in some ways there's sort of what people say, and then there's the reality. But I do think when you remove dignity from the equation, you put a whole group of people at risk. And it's something for people that might not be Christian, that are listening to this. Is that the kind of world that you want, where you're defending all these groups of people that are vulnerable because no one can agree that everyone is valuable? Like, we just switch, and it's arbitrary. It's that the view of dignity is just purely arbitrary. Oh, today I'm going to make it about function. Tomorrow I'm going to make it about intelligence. The next day I'm going to make it about maybe the color of my skin. The next day I'm going to make it about what gender or what sexuality I am. No. What gives you value has to be something deeper. And if it's not, and if it's something that's changeable, or if it's something that's based on what you can do or don't do or have done or will do in the future, who knows? Maybe we'll be able to predict that. Then you're at risk.
Absolutely. And we did an episode on designer babies, for example, right? And IVF. So, for example, with IVF and embryo selection, how does this materialist versus personalist framework change how we see the embryo?
Well, first of all, if you're a materialist, you can't see it as anything but a biological, this biological entity of which I have control. Me, my partner, now that doesn't even have to be a man and a woman in marriage. Me, my partner, 3 partners, whatever. We can create life, and we get to choose, since it's just biological life, we get to choose its characteristics. We get to choose whether it has blue eyes or not, whether it has this disease or not, and we can eliminate it. And if you eliminate it, it's just matter, right? All we are is matter. So there's no downside to doing it. The optics, in some way, of IVF is, and the reason that in some ways this is as, sort of dangerous, is that the optics are more distant from an unborn baby in the womb, like when you think about humanity, right? So these are babies in test tubes that are in frozen, little small frozen cells, in cells, and they're put away. So when you think about an IVF embryo, it's not physically connected to that mother, and it makes them in some ways more vulnerable and easier to dispose of. And for what? Because we have chosen, on the materialist view, to say this is mine, this is material, and it's mine, and it's property, and I can do what I want, and nothing happens anyway when you die. So it doesn't make any difference. On the personalist view, every one of these embryos is a child of God, is invaluable. And even though we have this problem of, and what's crazy is that every one of the frozen embryos is invaluable, just like every baby born from a frozen embryo is invaluable. There's no difference just because one is stored in a test tube and then in a cryocell, and one is implanted into a mother, or one is born naturally. So again, if what we're looking for is a broader and broader conception of who counts, it's the personalist that offers the broadest conception without getting into the absurd. We're not saying that skin cells or sperm are invaluable. We're saying that we're saying that conceived human beings are as valuable as a man or a woman at the end of life with end stage dementia, and everything counts in between.
Yes, and of course, with IVF and embryo selection, we're degrading the person to making them a product to be chosen, a product to be discarded. Children are not seen as gifts anymore, but as something that is owed. And also, what if that child doesn't turn out the way that you had, quote unquote, ordered, right? Is that it creates a very awkward dynamic between the child and the parent, or even a non-biological parent. As you mentioned, it could be a surrogate, it could be, etc. So obviously we see that there's so many issues with viewing the human person from a materialist perspective, and we discussed the issues with IVF. And you mentioned, again, with end-of-life care, how does this divide shape debates over euthanasia, especially when there's discussions about, quote unquote, quality of life discussion?
Right. That is actually really the key question in the end of life debate over assisted suicide and euthanasia are things like quality of life. And there's an interesting, let's see if I can get the quote right. It's long buried in the files of my memory, but there was an interesting quote from the Irish bishops back in the early 1980s. They were referring to abortion, but they said something interesting, which is people say nowadays that we should care about the quality of life. Here I'm paraphrasing. They said, life has the right to exist, or life has the right to quality because it exists. Life does not somehow derive the right to exist from the quality which circumstances seem likely to give it. And I thought that was a very powerful way of putting it, both on the abortion debate, but also on the euthanasia and assisted suicide debate at the end of life, is what do we start with as our fundamental unit of value? Is it the person's perception? Is it other people's perception of value? Or is it something deeper, unshakable, that's worth fighting for? Something that's changeable based on perception usually isn't worth fighting for. So if you think that the value of yourself, your dignity is going to change with a circumstance, you're really not going to fight that hard to stop that change or to advance that change. And on the other hand, if you think that this is unshakable and I want you to know it and I want you to feel it, then you will fight for it. I think that's something that we all could learn about suffering at the end of life, is when we're faced with a circumstance in which it seems like there's nothing we can do, what should we do? And part of the problem with medicine is that we're arrogant. We always think that we can and should do more instead of just being there. And I think that's that's a very, very dangerous thing. I've even met doctors that perform assisted suicide. And with the exception of one of them, they're all very nice people. And they all care about their patients at some fundamental level. And the temptation there is, I care so much then that when I'm at the end of my life, when you're at the end of your life and I can't do anything medically more for you, this is one more thing I can do. I can help you to end your life. Dr. Timothy Quill was one of these people. He's pretty famous in the assisted suicide movement, and he's helped many patients to commit suicide medically. He's kind of a nice guy. Like, you meet him, he's a nice guy. He's a very, very smart doctor, but he's kind of hand-wringing and saying, it's sort of a necessary evil. We really don't want to do this. But he coined what's called the principle of non-abandonment, which he says is basically like, you can't leave your patient. You've done all this stuff, and now you just can't leave your patient and say, I won't do any more. So if you think about that, and then you think about the kind of Catholic or Christian response, there are some things we just shouldn't do. So what do you do then? Well, I think presence is a word that we don't use enough. But being present to your patient, even if you aren't doing anything to them, is a powerful gift of self, right? So going back to our earlier discussion about what is a human person, that love, that self-giving, it doesn't say doing, it's self-giving. You're giving yourself to another person by being present and showing them somehow that they still count and that they still matter. But to say, well, I'm going to give you pills and tell you how many to take to end your life, that's not really showing you care, even if you think you're doing a caring thing. That's not affirming a person's value by doing that. So I do think that the presence of us as physicians, as nurses, as other healthcare practitioners, of just being with the patient is greater than all the technology that we have. That's really what's at the heart of medicine. The tools that we have are all for that same aim. I want to give you two examples, one from Christianity and one from outside Christianity, that illustrate this point. Let me start with the one outside of Christianity. In Islam, you are not allowed to draw pictures of beasts, human beings, in any of your art. You're not allowed to carve sculptures. That seems like an incredible restriction that they put on artistic works, right? They just say, you're not allowed to do this. Now, what did Muslim artists do? When they were told you're not allowed to do this, they had to use creativity and ingenuity to create beautiful works of art and mosaics. And we see these all over the world. The idea being, when sometimes a restriction is the only way you can open up your mind to creativity and to solving problems. When someone tells you, well, this is a limit on what you're allowed to do. In the same way, I was reading a saint's biography about a Polish nun who served people in Auschwitz. She ended up being killed. But she would take her daily bread ration and she would make rosaries. She would harden the bread with water, and then she would take strands of hair or cloth and she would sew them, basically make rosaries. She would give these to other prisoners that were in the camp. And here again is a restriction, right? There was a restriction on rations. You got a piece of bread a day. There was a restriction on open prayer in the camps. What could you do? What did she do? She used her mind and this limit of saying, you can't do this. And under that limit, she created this beautiful, simple, but beautiful objects of prayer and devotion because of that limit. Maybe that wouldn't have even come about if she hadn't had that limit. But I think about these examples of sometimes medicine has to hold itself back and say, maybe there are some things doctors just shouldn't do. And once we do that, we start to unlock what's actually possible and true and real and good.
That's so beautifully said. And it sounds like the doctor you're talking about was basically trying to play God, right? Obviously, part of the human condition is suffering.
Yes.
And so accepting that a doctor can't fix all the suffering. Sometimes it's just, as you said, being present with someone who's suffering. And always the doctor's role is to have compassion, and even whether they're suffering, to lower the suffering. But you may never take away the suffering by eliminating the sufferer. Right?
That's right. That hits the nail on the head. It's so interesting that assisted suicide is sort of the only supposedly medical procedure in which the patient doesn't get to experience the outcome of your intervention, right? So if you have an ear infection and I give you an antibiotic for it, that patient at the end of the antibiotic course is like, oh yeah, I feel better. Thank you so much. And if you have suffering at the end of life and someone gives you enough pills to kill yourself, neither the doctor nor the patient has any idea whether that actually worked or not. You're eliminating the suffering by eliminating the subject. And that's really problematic from a logical standpoint, but also from a medical standpoint. Like, is this even medicine, what we're doing to these people, or is it something else?
And obviously, the do no harm principle in Hippocratic medicine is you can't use your art of practicing medicine to harm a person.
That's right.
And I had a great discussion with Lee Sneed in an episode on infertility, and the fact that technology can't always fix infertility or other issues, and to just sit with what is, as opposed to trying to have something that always, quote unquote, fixing it.
Yes. And that's sort of the problem with medicine, is again, this temptation that you have this technology, you have this power, let me fix you. When I have, because I'm a pediatrician, I see a lot of kids with ADHD. The first thing I tell their parent is, there's nothing wrong with your child. There's nothing to fix. Medicine will help them or not help them, but I'm not here to fix your child, because they're a child of God and they are wonderful the way they are. And whatever therapy we choose, we don't want to change who this person is in front of them. And honestly, I say that right in front of the patient, because I want them to hear that, because they're, for years they've been told, like, you're a problem at school, you're a problem at home, you're this. Maybe even the parent told them that, but there isn't anything to fix. If that becomes your driving motivation, you need to look at your motivation, because sometimes I think doctors want to feel good themselves. The compassion turns into something that is, oh, I've done something and now I feel good. And that's not where medicine should be.
Exactly. With emerging technologies like gene editing or transhumanism, as we've also covered, are we redefining what it means to be human?
I think we are. And I think on the materialist premise, this makes sense, right? So things like gene editing. So let me take the two things separately. So transhumanism, let me start with that. Transhumanism would say essentially that we're working towards a world in which human beings are outdated, and that information becomes the prime unit of value. And there you see, it's kind of like materialists on steroids. Like, they don't realize what they've created. First, we said that human beings were transcendent. Now we've moved to the materialist world, in which the only thing that matters is matter. And then matter becomes information. And anybody who's actually human should fear this, right? Because that means there are some things more valuable than the human being created in all of their frailties. Gene editing, I'm a little bit more circumspect. There are aspects to gene editing that can be good. For example, we have the ability to cure some types of deafness in the womb through gene editing. Does a couple of things. One, that just to take that example, it shows you the humanity of an unborn child in the womb, by the way. Like, you curing something in a glob of tissue? No, you're curing something in a human person. And when that human person comes out, they're cured of this form of deafness. But I also think that it does offer hope to help to ease the suffering of some people. Now, if you talk to people in the deaf community about that, what do you think of gene editing to cure deafness in the womb? I think you'll get a very different response. People in the deaf community are very worried about technology like this, because what does it do? It might help to stigmatize people that are born deaf and that choose that life. And so they say, well, there's nothing wrong with us. So what are you trying to cure? We're not a disease. Okay. And I can understand that. So I think with gene editing, we have to be careful that we're not using gene editing for enhancement, number one, because that automatically leads to stigma. And number two, that even if we use gene editing to cure diseases or conditions, that we stick to that fundamental premise of personalism, which is in terms of your value, it doesn't matter. You still are valued whether you're deaf or whether you're not deaf. Because we've separated, the personalist separates value and function, right? So it's easy if you buy into the personalist idea, function and value are separated. And so if I cure or ameliorate your dysfunction, it doesn't affect your value at all. Like, we still love you, you still count, you still matter, whether you're deaf or not, whether we cure this metabolic disease or whether we don't. We just have to be careful to stick to that. And so, again, here's the technology like gene editing that says we can do this. And I agree with that. But is it good? Is this open question that we really need thoughtful people working on to help us and to be advocating for personalism in all of these discussions.
Where do you see the loss of an understanding of human dignity most clearly right now? Is it in medicine or in culture?
Gosh, that's such a good question. And it's kind of one of those things, like, in my mind, I'm thinking of these two words like medicine and culture and double arrows, I think medicine impacts culture and culture impacts medicine. And we really, as someone who's in medicine and deeply involved in it, and again, as someone who studied medical ethics or medicine in the Holocaust, you can see the power that medicine has to transform culture, both for good and for ill, right? Everything from weight loss drugs, for example, that are changing the way people view themselves, fitness, what have you, to what happened in the Holocaust, which is Nazi Germany, decided to use a metaphor, which is something like this. Germany is a body. The Jews, the Gypsies, the Slavs, they are a disease that are weakening this body, and they need to be cut out and taken out of this body. Now, that's a really simple metaphor that most people instantly get, even if you're not in healthcare. But now, who better to solve this problem of the German body than physicians and nurses, right? We are doctors, and now we can be curing the German Volk of this disease. And I think in some ways that is really important to make us more humble as physicians. So, but to show that how our views about what life is valued as can really impact the culture. Look how much doctors' views about everything from COVID to transgenderism to abortion to when conception begins, though the doctor's view has impacted the culture, and it makes it harder for truth sometimes to find its way out. On the other hand, culture affects medicine. So the people that are coming into medical school today are often people that were brought up in a secular culture or in a university culture that banned discussions about religion, faith, the transcendent from even entering any classroom. So what do you do now? Now you're in med school and you're being taught by people who are excluding those conversations. So culture can affect medicine as well. Now, I'm not a pessimist. I really actually think that we can lay people or people that aren't involved in medicine, people that are listening to this podcast right now, they can affect culture and they can feel confident by being faithful, loving Christian or Catholic people in our society, that by affecting culture in this way, that this will trickle up to medicine eventually. And it will embolden people that believe what we believe, that are in medicine now and that are practicing medicine. In the same way, if there are any healthcare practitioners that are listening, which I hope there are, that doing what you do in your small way will help to impact the culture. There's a lot of emphasis in med schools now on advocacy. And they even teach classes on it. And usually that's political advocacy, and usually it's progressive or liberal political advocacy. Like, there aren't many medical students that would be accepted for advocating for pro-life OBGYN group, for example. So their emphasis on advocacy is usually for progressive political causes. However, what I try to tell my students of any stripe is that advocacy begins with the person in front of you. Show that person in the quiet room of the doctor's office that they are invaluable. That's the best advocacy you could do, because that person leaves that office feeling respected, feeling like a human being. And it's just it's one patient at a time. The best advocacy you can do is not holding signs and going to political rallies. It's honestly like in your day-to-day life where people don't see it. What I try to do, I'm not always successful, but what I try to do is be really kind and respectful, especially to my vulnerable patients, my poorer patients. I call their mom, ma'am, or miss. I call their dad, sir. And I know the child is listening, and I know what they hear outside of my office, which is they don't ever hear anybody call their mom or dad, sir or ma'am, or treat them with respect. But I want them to see what normal actually is. And I think that's helpful. I think that's helpful because children will remember things, and then they'll grow up thinking, hey, when I was in that office, nobody treated me like an animal. They treated me in a safe, clean place with respect. I'm hoping they take that away. That has nothing to do with medicine or science. That has to do with this whole other sphere of reality.
I think that's so beautiful. And that's what we need to recapture, right? The understanding of human dignity for everybody, especially the most vulnerable, as you said, who are at most risk. So the question in terms of the equality problem, right? The personalist view versus the materialist view. In the materialist view, dignity might be tied to intelligence, autonomy, capacity, as we discussed. In this view, can we still say that all human beings are equal?
I suppose you could, but you'd have a hard time making that argument because you can just see with your own naked eye and with your own senses that people just aren't equal in terms of their abilities, their capacities. And so it ends up being an arbitrary thing of what you value, what you think is important. This is why and I mentioned this before, but I really don't like identity politics. I understand that there are some groups of people that have been trampled on. And I understand why we must bring them to the forefront and uplift those vulnerable populations. But by focusing on the fact, for example, that someone is Black, like the Black Lives Matter movement, just take that as an example, I don't think that that's getting to the root cause. The root cause of the treatment of African Americans in this country and other places in the world is the rejection of personalism. It's the idea that I, myself, can decide what's valuable and what's not valuable. But guess what? I've excluded you. I've excluded you from personhood. So the embracing of personhood is basically saying, you know what? It's not that I don't respect Black culture or Hispanic culture or whatever the identity people choose, even Catholic culture, right? You can't have people that and we have people in the Catholic Church that somehow project that they're more valuable or more true or more good because they're traditional Catholics or because they're whatever Catholics. You can't have that. You can't have that focus on identity because all it takes is for someone to say, okay, that's interesting, but I don't believe it. And then they can do whatever they want to you. It's only when we say no matter what you do, no matter what your color of your skin is or whatever, you have the same value as everybody else, that we can begin to get to true equality. That's an idea worth fighting for, right? Then it becomes, okay, if I look at a disparity in healthcare between Blacks and whites, then I can say, that's not wrong because one is Black and one is white. That's wrong because both are human. And if one person is infant mortality, for example, if one group of people's babies are dying at a higher rate than another person's, I have to value everyone the same. And so I'm going to work harder to do that.
Exactly. So with materialism, does it ultimately undermine the very idea of human rights it claims to support?
Yeah, again, it does because it makes human rights something that is arbitrary. And you can look at historical examples, different political systems. I mean, things like even like the French Revolution, they thought they're working for equality, right? But they then strip every religious person of rights and murder thousands of people. It just doesn't make any sense. It really, because it makes autonomy absolute and preferences become dominant, it makes value arbitrary. Now, if you're a materialist, you're forced into that lot because you're rejecting everything outside the material world. So you can't appeal to anything higher, which is why that curious phrase that we talked about earlier, like whenever you hear someone say, I think people should be able to do whatever they want as long as they're not hurting anybody. Question them on that last phrase. Why do I need to accept as long as I'm not hurting anybody? Why should I accept that? I could reject that piece, but you're fiating in this universal principle. And let's take that. Once you admit to that universal principle, people shouldn't hurt other innocent people. Okay, well, now let's delve into that why. Now you're admitting things that are no longer arbitrary, that are no longer preference-based, that are no longer autonomy-based. That's true for everyone. And if you admit that, then you're already on this road to personalism, where there's something transcendent. Even if you don't want to say it's God, there's something transcendent. Honestly, if materialists would convert to personalism, I'm okay with them not believing in God at first, because God will get them. And just think that there's something outside yourself that's more important than your preferences, and God will take care of the rest for you.
Yes. And also what's wrong with what you had mentioned is, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, well, we care about something hurting that person specifically. It's not just about whether it hurts someone else. We care if an anorexic or bulimic person continues in that way. We care if an alcoholic continues that way. We care if someone wants to chop off their body parts because of a different notion of their identity, right?
Yes.
Sex identity distress. So it's not just about whether it's hurting somebody else. We care about the person, himself or herself, who's being affected by it.
It's that age-old question, am I my brother's keeper? And the difference, the sharp contrast there, again, between materialism and personalism, is personalism has this bit in there of solidarity. Like, I can never be what I am until you are what you ought to be. And because of that, we're fully committed to another human being, even if they say, I'm not valuable.
So can secular bioethics sustain a robust notion of equality, or is it borrowing from a worldview it no longer accepts?
I love that question because I think it's the latter. I think they want to be able to say that even something like equality is something to be strived for, and they want to be able to have a rational justification for it. But unless there are these foundational concepts, universal concepts that all people believe, it's very hard to come to that conclusion. There are other modes of thought around this, right? So there's a really famous bioethicist of the Orthodox Christian tradition who's passed away now, but the late Tristan Engelhardt used to talk about what he called moral strangers, that essentially we've lost common foundational beliefs. And so that the best we can do is be friends with our moral friends, and people who are outside are not moral enemies, but they're moral strangers. And essentially that you have these sort of spheres that kind of live together. Sometimes they abut, sometimes they don't. There is that way of thinking, but I don't think Catholics really subscribe to that very much, because we believe in the transformative power of Christ in culture and also in medicine. That it's not enough to leave people in spheres of influence or their own faith, but we're meant to be a light that illuminates not just ourselves and our own families and our own religion, but illuminates society, culture, and our whole world. Catholics are optimists like that. Like, I think that's one of the things that keeps me in this faith and draws me to it, is this optimism. Like, we can change things, and we can make the lives of people who don't yet see better. And we're not to leave them to themselves. There's hard work to be done.
So now let's talk about how to rebuild this vision of the human person. And so of someone who practices medicine or even just has a Christian personalist worldview, or even, let's say, a secular personalist worldview, how does it change the way that physician actually treats patients, the most vulnerable among us, and just your layperson who embraces this kind of worldview?
Yeah, I think it's in the way you act in the small things. That by far is the most important thing, because it's the kind of fuel for the engine that keeps you going toward your purpose, which is to uplift another human being, particularly in medicine. I have this phrase that I say, that I tell my students, which is, you can have hard days in medicine, but never bad days, as long as you do what you were called to do. Okay. It's very simple. Hard days, but never bad days. And what I mean by that is, in my business in pediatrics, just give you that example, but if you spend 15 minutes with a patient and you have given them a safe place, a patient and their family, you give them a safe place, a clean place, a place of love, you have made that an accepting, tolerant place, no matter how hard your day is, you can look back on that and say, I did this one absolutely good thing. And it was a hard day, but it was not bad. Like, that is something that you have left. And maybe nobody remembers it. Maybe nobody remembers it at all, but you know you did it. And that is really a wonderful thing. I think it's different from materialism, because my satisfaction about that, or my happiness about that, is, I'm hoping, is based in what I did for another person rather than in how I feel at the moment. This is, I think, that a lot of doctors get burned out, but I think the cure for burnout are these small acts of love that you do. And that doesn't matter. You don't have to be Christian or Catholic to do these things. Any doctor can do it. Any healthcare practitioner can do it. Be intentional about loving acts and about just being yourself, no matter what the pressure is outside. I'll tell you this brief story, and I'm not doing this to toot my own horn, but it's because I consider this a gift from God. As you know, and you mentioned, I've won a lot of teaching awards and other things, but nothing compares to this moment that I had in my clinical life. One day, so I teach medical students, as you know, and I was doing a session. I have a session every month that we talk to recovering addicts from Narcotics Anonymous. They'll come in and they'll tell their stories. Now, these are fourth year med students they're teaching. So those fourth year med students are very advanced in their training, and they know medically how to treat addiction and how to find people resources for addiction. So the purpose of me having these Narcotics Anonymous patients come in and talk is to highlight the human experience of addiction. What did these people suffer? And realizing, hey, these stories are patient stories, and these could be one of your patients. And the students are always in rapt attention. And these are very, very powerful stories of both suffering and of redemption. And they'll talk about like what healthcare practitioners did right and what they did wrong, and some of their encounters. One day in this panel, there was a woman who looked kind of vaguely familiar to me, but I was like, oh, maybe she was on a panel from a previous month. And she was telling this story about how she was a teen mom, and and she was an addict when she was a teen as well, and had some violent outbursts. So in her chart, it's like actually labeled. There's this like pink label that says, hey, a warning, this person has had a violent outburst, whatever. So she's like, I knew everyone there knew that I was that person. And then I brought my baby in, and I'm like very scared, very nervous. What are they going to think of me? And this doctor comes in, and he's super sweet, super kind, held my baby, said, I know all about your history. It's okay. We're going to take it from here. We'll be partners. And she's like, that moment changed everything for me, because I realized there were people out there who saw me as a human being and not as a drug addict or a teen mom or whatever. And she's like, and that doctor is standing right there and pointed to me. And I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. And it was sort of embarrassing, because it looked like, it might have looked to the class like, oh, I got this person to toot my horn, So I didn't even remember that I had done that, because it was like 3 years ago. But on reflecting on that, I'm like, that's the highlight of my career right there. Because I didn't even know I was doing it. And again, I'm a Catholic Christian, so the way I integrate my faith a lot of times is in that intentional aspect of trying to love a person in that room, recognizing their vulnerabilities and then doing it. But what was interesting was that encounter happened. I forgot about it. 3 years went by, but to that person, that was a critical encounter in her life. And I think we all have that opportunity to do that. You may not get credit for it. You may not realize that you did something like that. But ultimately, personalism is not just a philosophy. It is a way of life. It is just like Christianity and Catholicism. It's a way of life. Like, I'm not going to sit there and try to convince you like a philosopher would, oh, personalism is better than materialism, blah, blah, blah. In the end, that's not what I want your listeners to understand. It's acting on it. It's act like everyone has dignity all the time, insofar as we can as human beings. But that's the practical end of all of this is don't exclude people, show extreme tolerance for who counts as a human, broaden like that until we broaden that to include everybody, we're an imperfect society. And then act with intention and love with the people that are the most vulnerable.
Beautifully said. And of course, we act that way because they do have human dignity, correct?
Yes.
So if we recover a true understanding of the human person, what changes? You already talked about what changes in medicine if you treat someone with the human dignity that person deserves. But what changes in law and what changes in culture?
Yeah. So obviously, all of these things, law and culture, and then our own personal actions, they're all interrelated. Law is the codification of societal norms or philosophy. So when we work on the culture, eventually that does work. It should work its way up to law. Likewise, law, I think, can affect culture. So we have something like Dobbs, the Dobbs decision, which was amazing. What that should do is say, well, if, before people would say, well, you have to accept abortion because it's the law. Well, it's not the law anymore. And because it's not the law anymore, that justification, first of all, is gone. But also it allows laws to be put in place that respect true things. And eventually that culture will change as long as we can hold on to that law. So I do think that again, this kind of reclaiming of the transcendent has to have effects in cultural law because that's the way human beings are. We automatically, naturally are going to turn outward. And that makes a huge difference. And I will say this, even if it doesn't happen in the law or in the culture, it can still happen with you, right? There's so many societies today where they live in atheist cultures, but they are, they're still Christians. They're still God-loving people that are living their lives that way under oppression, under, atheistic or secularist laws. And still, we have to acknowledge that's still a very, very good thing. And in that way, it's still spreading the gospel.
And so for someone who is not Christian or Catholic, and we talked about this a little bit, that you can still be a personalist, but more specifically, what does secular personalism look like for that person who doesn't have belief in the God or a Christian God? How can that person still act out of this kind of philosophy that is focused on human dignity?
Yeah, I think that's, again, an excellent question. One step, I think, is for people that are secular or don't believe in God or maybe aren't Christian, is to ask themselves a hard question, which is, do you accept that there's some things we just can't know? Do you accept this idea of mystery? Like, hey, this is a very bad example, but mathematics is a discipline of knowledge, right? And I wasn't very good at it. I was okay. I was good enough to become a doctor, but like my younger son is a sophomore in high school and he's in the last calculus class that I ever took to get into med school. So I wasn't that great in math, but I know there are some things outside of my ability in the field of mathematics that are absolutely true, but my mind can't just get around it. And I accept that. Like, you could call it the mystery of math. Like, okay, I know up to calculus 2, maybe I don't even know that anymore, but everything beyond that is kind of a mystery. So I hope that secular people kind of try to look, hey, maybe there is this sphere of knowledge and maybe I don't need to concern myself with that, although we all should. But maybe if I don't understand this part, it's okay. Okay. So the acceptance of things outside the rational world is a start. I think the second thing is for people that are secular to do thought experiments with themselves about when they encountered true things. What was the experience, not argument, but what was the experience like when you encountered someone who you loved? Is that purely biological? Do you believe that your love for this person is not transcendent, is purely biological, and is only real because you happen to choose that it's real? But I think most people, if they pondered their own experience, they would find, well, that doesn't seem to comport with my experience. There seems to be something that tells us we're more than just we're more than just our parts.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also true with bad experiences too. Like there are men and women who have 15 or 20 sexual partners. Okay, if you ever met any of these people, which I have, the experience of meeting them is they're not happy. They're not fulfilled. That has nothing to do with science or data. It's your experience of this person. And that tells us some truth about the world. Well, wait a minute. Maybe just choosing isn't enough. Maybe there is something better that transcends just our choices. So I think outside, and this is not my original thought, but outside of reason, there is experience. John Paul II talks a lot about this in his philosophy, which is you can grasp truth from experience. And it's not my truth, your truth. It's the truth. But we have to be really attentive to that. To do that involves humility. To say, hey, in that first caveat I had, which is like, accept that there's mystery. And number two, accept that you can grasp truth from experience. And then the third thing is act on it. Like I would tell a secular person, act like a personalist, even if you don't quite understand it yet. You'll be happier. They'll be happier. You'll find yourself fulfilled. And I think that's sort of the third thing is like, just act like one. It's not going to do you any harm to intentionally love someone in this moment. Suffering is a great example. You brought it up earlier, and we didn't get to talk much about it today, but suffering is at the heart of what medicine is. And the contrast between materialism and personalism on the issue of suffering is so deep and so wide. And we all want to believe that, suffering has some meaning for us. And if we don't, we're like looking into this abyss. That's something else. That contemplating the nature of suffering, I think, will bring people toward personalism.
So for someone who's never thought about these questions before, why does it actually matter for their life?
Because, well, let me take a 10,000 foot view and put on my good Catholic boy hat. Because I would say that our destiny is to be with God. And I think you should care because what God wants us to do is be drawn to Him through truth. And this is our experience of human life. And by honoring people's personhood, I think you are being drawn closer to God's creatures and therefore to Him Himself. I think it also matters because everyone, whether you are Christian or not Christian, we all want a safer, more beautiful, more humane world. And you're not going to get there down the materialist road. The materialist road of radical individualism, autonomous absolutism, a lack of solidarity. We're a society, not a community. You're not going to get to where most of our ideals fall. But personalism offers you this path. And again, we don't have to do anything earth-shaking. We don't have to win elections or change politics or all of those things. All those things would be great, be fine. But it's what you do in the small things that add up to changing the world, that have this sort of ripple effect and that goes out from there to change other people's lives.
And lastly, if we get the question of what is a human being wrong, what's at stake?
Well, you can see from our history what's at stake. If we are wrong, then so personalism posits that the fundamental unit of value on this earth is the human person herself. Jacques Maritain, that French philosopher I mentioned earlier, said, society is for the human person, not the other way around. Okay, and that little line puts this all into perspective. Why do we even have a society? It's to uphold the dignity of this individual person. So imagine if we get this question wrong, we are destroying, demeaning, degrading the ultimate unit of value. It's like think of the most valuable thing in your house, material value. Think of material value in your house. It's like setting it on fire because you think you know everything, or because you don't accept mystery, or because it's too hard. No one would ever do that. But if we get this question wrong, so much more is at stake than a material good. It's a person themselves. And I think we just can't let that happen. Again, as far gone sometimes as society seems to be, embers count. And you may feel like you're the only person that thinks this way, but you're an ember, and embers count. They can light fires. My dad, who passed away, was a man of letters, as we say. He was a doctor, but he knew English literature and he knew Latin poetry. And he told me, when I was having a bioethics discussion with him once, he told me about this quote from Ovid, which is relevant. It's the quote is, and I don't know the Latin. He knew the Latin. He recited in Latin, which I thought was extraordinary. But the English translation is, water hollows out stone, not by force, but by persistence. And I thought that was an incredible quote, because that's sometimes how we feel as Catholics or Christians or personalists or whatever, is that we have this stone that's blocking our way. And what Ovid is trying to teach you is just stay in there. The drip, 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 drip of the water will eventually wear down this stone. And so I would encourage people, to listen to your podcasts, because these are all great. These are, you have great guests on, to encourage that and know they're participating in, maybe it's small and not earth shattering as an individual, but if they listen to this, if they try to change the culture, if they support physicians and other healthcare practitioners who support life, they'll be part of that drip, 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 drip that we need, the persistence that we need to change the culture.
Wow, that's beautiful, Dr. Fernandes, and thank you for inspiring us and also sharing both your love for philosophy and medicine all together. We are richer for it, so thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. I'll be back anytime you need me.
Absolutely, we'll definitely have you back on. That was great. Sorry for the... Whoops, hold on. For my conversation with Dr. Ashley Fernandes, a physician, bioethicist, clinical professor of pediatrics at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and the associate director of the Center for Bioethics at The Ohio State University College of Medicine, here are 5 key takeaways on what's at stake for human dignity between materialism versus Christian personalism. 1. The real disagreement in bioethics is about the human person. Most bioethical disagreements, whether about abortion, euthanasia, or IVF, aren't just policy disputes. They stem from a deeper divide. What is a human being? If we get that wrong, everything else follows. 2. Medicine can tell us what we can do, but not what we should do. Science, technology, and modern medicine can extend life, end life, or manipulate life, but they cannot answer the moral question, is it right? That moral question lies outside of science, and that's where bioethics becomes essential. 3. If dignity depends on function, equality collapses. If human worth is based on intelligence, autonomy, or capacity, the most vulnerable people among us, preborn babies, disabled, and elderly people, are at risk. A functional view of dignity makes human worth conditional. 4. Materialism reduces the person, while personalism protects the person. Materialism sees the human being as merely biology, chemistry, neurons, and preference. Personalism sees the human being as rational, relational, moral, and inherently valuable. That difference shapes how we treat others, either as problems to solve or persons to love. 5. Restoring dignity starts with how we treat the person in front of us. Rebuilding a culture of human dignity doesn't begin with policy, it begins with presence. Seeing and treating each person as inherently valuable has a ripple effect that can transform medicine and culture. If we get the human person wrong, everything else unravels. Christian personalism affirms the dignity of every human being, while materialism reduces the person to function, preference, and matter. Because truth matters and human dignity isn't optional. This is bioethics, babe. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.